I'm Oliver.
Welcome back to Orange, and today we have a very special guest, the Associate Professor at the University of Melbourne, expert in immunology, and just so happens to be a Chief Scientific Officer at CSL. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much for having me.
Lovely to have you on the podcast. Ben and I have been looking forward to this, for quite some time. We've been trying to operate and get people of your caliber onto the podcast just to see how they ended up in the positions that they were in. Yeah. So thank you for coming on the podcast. We'll get into kind of the first question. So Andrew, for us as well, tell us a little bit about yourself in general. Like, what do you do? Those types of things.
Well, so as you said, I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at CSL, and I guess alongside of that role, I'm also what's called the Senior Vice President of Research. So that means that CSL has a global research group of about 300 or 400 people spread across Australia, Switzerland, Germany, and the US, and so I look after that large group of people and the research that they're doing. And then from a Chief Scientific Officer perspective, it's more about the direction and the integrity and the value of the work we're doing. So it's two roles combined in CSL. I've been doing that for about 16 years now, and loved it the whole time. And before that, I was in a small biotech company for about 8 years, and before that, I had an academic career at the University of Melbourne for about 8 years. So sort of academic career, small biotech, and then a bigger company for the last 15 or 16 years.
Wow. Yeah, it's an interesting background, and we'll get into your sort of past a little bit more later on and like how you got into this position. But maybe, I guess I'm just curious about what do you do on a day-to-day basis when you rock up at work? I mean,
what does a CSO of Australia's biggest biotech do?
Well, I think most of the scientists that work for me, they wonder the same thing.
Well, now's your chance.
Well, and sometimes it just feels like you go to meetings the whole day, But it's a really interesting job. I love science. I've always loved science. The connection between science and medicine, I think, is a fantastic thing to focus your interests on. So most of my day is thinking about what's happening in CSL research, what's happening in CSL more broadly, what's happening out there in the greater world in terms of patients and unmet medical need and how we can contribute to that. So that's sort of a macro perspective. On the micro side of things, there's always something happening, whether it's a project that's gone off the rails, whether it's a great result, whether one of your staff members wants to leave and go somewhere else, there's lots of things like that as well. So, there's always those smaller picture things that keep you interested on a day-to-day basis. My office is right embedded within the lab, so I see all the scientists every day, and I can corner them and talk to them about their projects, or they can corner me and tell me about their projects. But then alongside of that, there's sort of the bigger picture stuff of CSL as a global company and how we're delivering for the patients that we work for, our shareholders, and how we compete with everybody else out there as well.
Fantastic. I mean, as operating within the kind of lab area of CSL, how many projects are you juggling at the moment?
So it's funny you should ask, because the size of the portfolio and how you allocate your resources across projects is always a big challenge, and we've just been having a really close look at that. We have a brilliant person that works for me. She's head of what we call our portfolio management process. And so I would say at the moment we have anywhere between 25 and 30 main projects that are in what we call a stage gate 1 portfolio. They're projects that are on their way, hopefully at some stage, to the clinic, into patients. But behind that, we have another 20 to 30 projects that are mainly about collaborations with people in the medical research institutes, within the universities, and they're really early stage research that may or may not, lead to something that we would like to pursue on a more formal basis. So I guess overall about, 40 or so projects that are in the preclinical stage, but then quite a few of the people in my team also work in or on projects that have progressed into the clinic as well. And there's another portfolio of clinical programs, but mainly those, say, 40 to 50 preclinical projects.
I read somewhere on a certain website or article that was published about you that you always start off with sort of the unmet clinical need, and then you work backwards from there.
Yeah.
Given that, like, you've obviously overseen a lot of different projects, what's been your favorite one so far in the past?
That's a good question. The most recent one always tends to rise to the top. So, where CSL works in rare diseases, and we've been working on new treatments for a group of patients who have what's called hereditary angioedema. So they have a mutation in a gene that means ultimately they have uncontrolled vascular leakage and swelling at random moments in their life. So, and that can be fatal depending on how the attack occurs, whether it occurs, say, in your stomach or your larynx or your arm or your face. And those we know what the genetic lesion is. We know what the pathway that's activated is. And those patients have been treated pretty poorly for the last 40 to 50 years. That's sort of the history of people with rare disease. They're usually, not many therapies available to them. But the way they were being treated was in a way that's called on demand. So you would wait for them to have an attack, and then you would treat them with the missing factor that you'd purified from someone else's blood. So these people had pretty miserable lives, just waiting to have an attack, ending up in hospital and getting a treatment for it. But just recently, we've developed a new therapy where they can have a self-administered injection once a month, and they won't have any attacks at all for the most part. So that at the moment is just in the process of approval, going through the regulatory authorities in Europe and the US and here in Australia. So hopefully that'll translate into a whole new way of life for them, where they're much healthier and can lead full and normal lives.
Andrew, I'm curious, like, coming from an academic background in research, you more translational and kind of in the biotech space, the speed of development between the two obviously is very different. If you can talk on that point in terms of how it's different from academia.
Well, so I mean, I to your point that you made just before, Ben, the two types of research can generally start from different perspectives. So academic research starts from a problem that someone wants to learn more about, and it can end up being pretty reductionist in the end. They just delve further and further and further in the problem, and ultimately end up coming up with lots of interesting information. And sometimes that translates into therapies for people with disease, and sometimes it doesn't. But that doesn't really matter, because that wasn't really the point to start with. Whereas so there's the time frame on that is not really limited, other than by the fact that you continue to make exciting discoveries and you continue to justify your funding. With biotech or company-based research, you actually, as you said, you start with a patient who is not treated well. And then you work your way backwards into the science, and having got a handle on the science, you think about, well, how could we develop a new therapy based on our understanding of that? And you go forward from there. And look, it'd be great to say that process takes a few years, but the project I just talked to you about, we first got involved in that project probably in about maybe 2004, 2005. So it's almost 20 years later of a whole lot of work, with a few sidetracks here and there, thinking about getting it wrong, and then having to get it right. 20 years, and finally you're getting a medicine. So, but in the end, you sort of get there. You know what the objective is, and you get there as quickly as you can. So it doesn't always take that long. And I guess, care of COVID and care of the rate of development of those RNA vaccines in COVID, there's sort of the expectation that things will get done faster in the future than they have in the past. But, I suspect that won't be the case, because in the end, when you're developing new drugs, the first thing you have to do is make sure they're going to be safe for everybody. That, not only do they cure the disease, they kill the person that's getting them as well. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think Oliver and I are both of the persuasion that the most impact that you can have on society, from a medical perspective, is actually being involved in a biotech company, because fundamentally, like, every treatment that we have has to be manufactured somewhere, and without it, medicine is left defenseless. So I think there's a trend that I've noticed in a lot of different companies where they almost have this product that serves some very obvious purpose. It sort of fits an existing market need, and then they leverage that to fund research and development for projects that sort of align more with their mission statement. So you've got like Amazon that might sort of sell Amazon Web Services and make a lot of profit off that, and then use that profit to fund their more sort of commercial retail side and expand retail. You've also got Tesla making those really expensive cars and then using it to sort of transition the world to sustainable energy. Where would you say, like, I have a feeling that CSL is kind of aligned on that a little bit. Could you talk a little bit on that?
Yeah, look, I think so. The trick, of course, is always getting the balance right. If you're not achieving the really successful products, then you don't have the resources to fund the ones that are more difficult. But as an example, one of the patient groups that we focus a lot on are those patients with primary immune deficiency, and really they can't make antibodies themselves, so they're susceptible to infections, and they get treated with immunoglobulins or antibodies that we purify from other patients, and that is a huge market for CSL. It's CSL's biggest product. It's billions of dollars a year. Yet we know for subgroups of those patients where we understand exactly where the genetic lesion is, where the mutation is, that we could develop a gene therapy to treat that patient, and rather than being on therapy for the rest of their life, they would essentially be cured. We don't yet understand what the commercial model is for that. That particular subset of patients with PID, probably a frequency of about 1 in 500,000 people have that disease. So we're working on developing a gene therapy, a potential cure for them, but we're not sure yet of what that commercial model looks like, whether we can, have a profitable product. But we know it's the right thing to do for those patients, and we know that gene therapies are going to be more frequently used in the future. So we've just taken the decision to commit to it and to see where we get to. And of course, that's what you said, we're using the resources that we have available care of the successful products to fund that type of research. But it's always a balance. So if we have a big portfolio of projects, you can do the type of project we just mentioned, as long as you're doing the other ones to sort of maintain that balance as well.
Absolutely. So I suppose from my perspective, I see a lot of scientific researchers in academia transitioning into the biotech space or entrepreneurial space.
Yeah.
Is that something that CSL supports? Is that something that you think is a good kind of move forward?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think one of the keys to CSL's continued success is really ensuring and encouraging the growth of the small company sector, here in Australia. So, we know that, if you're going to be competitive, you have to encourage an environment of innovation, not just within your own company, but where you're established and where you're based. So we support a lot of research in an academic environment, and we do our best to support small companies as well. And we do that in a number of ways. So, we're co-investors in venture funds. So we put our own dollars into venture funds, and they invest in small companies. But just recently, we've made an investment in an incubator space with Melbourne University and the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. So probably if you went back 4 or 5 years, there were people in my team and others in this precinct sort of asking that question: what is it that's holding the precinct back in terms of more entrepreneurship, more translation, and better outcomes from all of the academic research that occurs here. And one of the things that comes to mind straight away is, unlike a lot of other big similar centres, overseas in Europe or the US, we don't really have, or we didn't have, any dedicated wet lab incubator space, and that just happened to coincide with us putting up a new building at the top of Elizabeth Street. There, it's 18 floors. And we hadn't decided yet what was going to go in all of the floors, and we came up with the idea, well, why don't we just turn 2 of those floors into a biotech incubator for small startup companies? And Melbourne Uni and WeHi were thinking along the same lines, and so we all got together. We established a partnership. We got $25 million from Breakthrough Victoria, the state government. Right. So good on them for helping out. And we fitted out an incubator in that building that can hold up to, 20, 30 small companies. And it's just recently opened, and the first tenants are just coming in, as we speak. So that's something that we've done, really directly, created a physical environment for those companies to come into and work. And so my feeling, I hope it's successful. I don't think we've left any stone unturned in order to try and make it successful. So we just, fingers crossed, 5 years from now, I hope it's sort of doubled in size rather than sort of shrinking and going away. But, it's there now, and, I'm really hopeful that it'll make a big contribution to the sector.
Brilliant. I mean, it's right in the precinct as well. Yeah, so you'll attract a lot of, very intelligent individuals to the area.
And if you see it looks beautiful as well. So there's like a whole floor of offices and co-working space, and then the labs are just gorgeous, fitted out beautifully. They look nice now because there's no scientists in them to mess them up. But, once you get a bunch of companies in there and scientists, it'll start looking messy and like people actually doing stuff.
It'll start looking like a lab.
It'll start looking like a lab. Now it just looks like a beautiful space with white benches and clean walls. But
I tell you what, that new building, the big red CSL sign emanates through my bedroom window. It's incredible.
Well, my son just lives down in Barclay Street, just near 7 Seats down there. He tells me when he looks out his bedroom window, he can see the CSL sign on top of it.
It almost reflects off all the glass in all the other buildings.
I'm not sure we thought about that when we were putting that.
I thought it was purposeful.
It just turns out that that's sort of a high point in the area, and that's the biggest building there, so you can sort of see it from all over the place.
I think we should organise a tour of that facility and
that would be incredible.
Film it and everything. Yeah.
It's a great building. It's all open plan offices. It's as I said, it's about 17 or 18 floors, but it's 8 floors of labs. There's like manufacturing facilities in there. There's research facilities, and then there's all of the corporate offices and salespeople in there as well. So it's a real mix of everybody that's involved in a pharma company. And the shared working spaces are unbelievable. If you want to think of ways to get people back into the office after all the working from home during COVID, just put up a building like that has an environment that people are going to want to work in. And it's a bit like that, actually.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's probably a lot of aspiring biotech founders listening, and so that entrepreneurship culture is growing in Australia. One of the things I wanted to mention is that like CSL started off as like a Commonwealth-backed plasma fractionation company, and then you transitioned and expanded to all of these different industries. A list of projects I can't even scroll through. They're so long. If you were starting a biotech company like today, and you wanted to go through the sort of Juma bioincubator, what would you start from? Like, would you start from producing and manufacturing something that's already needed, or would you start at some clinical problem and work backwards? What would be your advice?
Look, I think having the clinical problem in mind and an innovative solution is the place to start, and you can be along that path either a tiny bit, or you can be along it a fair way and really know where you're heading. But the start is having the great idea and demonstrating that you're someone that can follow through on it, and then thinking about and putting in place the resources to do it. And that's sort of the challenge, understanding I've got a great idea, but what are all the steps that I have to go through to realise that? Where am I going to get the money? Where am I going to get the lab space? Where am I going to get the people? But, I think, that's one of the things where there is a lot of opportunity in Australia, is to make sure all of our really smart people in our universities and institutes have a much better understanding of that process, that it's not something that, they have to go to inordinate lengths to understand and to discover. It's part of undergraduate university courses. It's just something that people coming through courses know, that entrepreneurship is embedded in our education system rather than something that's really hard to discover and learn about. And it's sort of a bit like that at the moment still, where people I think are having great ideas, but then they're just at a loss as to really the next steps you need to take to get those moving forward.
What have been some of the most interesting companies that have sort of moved into the Juma bioincubator space?
So look, honestly, there's I think 4 or 5 companies that have signed up. There's been 20 or 30 companies that have moved through, that have been through it, and I think there's just 1 or 2 that have moved in. And I think the operators of the incubator haven't announced that yet, so I might be doing them as a service if I announced it for them about who's moved in and who hasn't.
Yeah.
I suppose another question then might be, what are the prerequisites of actually signing up?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And really, when you put in place a model incubator like that, you really spend a lot of time setting up the criteria for the type of tenants you want. So down there's a big focus on really early stage small companies. So there's a lot of parameters are set up to avoid having too many later stage companies, having service providers in there and not companies that are actually developing new opportunities. So there's set numbers of companies and space that's allocated to companies of certain sizes, and certainly the majority of space at this stage is put aside for small companies with maybe 1, 2, 3 people who are just starting on their journey. Not so much companies that have got 20 or 30 people and they're in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical programs. So what we're really saying is we're asking is it do we agree that it's a good idea? It's not completely crazy, and can you demonstrate that your company has at least got some level of sustainability? You've got some funding, you've secured some backing, other people believe in your idea, and we can bring you into the environment without taking a lot of risk ourselves.
Very interesting. So would you say a lot of the projects that are going through there are stemming out of academia?
Yeah, no, for sure. Most of them, I would say. There's a lot of there is a lot of I guess venture money around at the moment for startups and really good ideas. So I would say if you're out there in one of the universities or institutes at the moment, you've got a really good idea. The dollars are there to support that, and the environment's there. And I think the universities, institutes are all making an effort to promote that entrepreneurship. So it's a good time.
Brilliant.
I think one of the things that we're interested about in you generally is sort of how you got into the space. Obviously, you've reached this almost like pinnacle of success for a scientist in Australia, and I guess I'm wondering, you were a high school student, went to Oberon High School. The only other thing I see is like PhD at UniMelb. What happened in between? Like, how did you go from a kid at a high school to a scientist and then to someone in biotech?
Well, it's a good question, and like strangely enough, the high school down the road from Oberon High School was Belmont High School, and I was in touch with the chief scientific officer at CSIRO not that long ago, and it turns out she went to Belmont High School just down the road from where I went to high school. So yeah, it's a long way from Oberon High School to a PhD and then being a chief scientist at CSL. But I had a really strong interest in science. But beyond that strong interest in science, I had really no clue. I mean, I've done an undergraduate degree. I may as well do honours because research looks interesting. I've done honours. I may as well do a PhD. That looks pretty interesting. And then when I went into, when I finished my PhD, I did a postdoc for a variety of reasons. I did my postdoc here at the university as well. And I did that for a few years. And, it was immunology focused. And there was a lot of, I guess, applied research. It was at the veterinary school, and the person I was working there for had a really strong entrepreneurship going on, and he was really focused on translating his work into veterinary medicine. So we were working on basic biology that impacts either human disease or veterinary disease. And because it was in that faculty, there was a strong interest in translating into animal health. But animal health wasn't really something that I wanted to spend a lot of time doing. I'd seen the value of really high quality research and how it could benefit society, and that was back in sort of 94, 95, and that was when the first wave of biotech was taking off in Australia. So the first biotech companies were just being set up, and there were jobs available for scientists, which there hadn't been before. And one of the leading companies at that time was a company called Amrad, one of the main forerunners of the biotech sector here, and it was interesting. Their research group at that time was being run by a guy who was also working at WeHi at the time, whose name was Doug Hilton.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
So I met Doug then, and Doug said, "Why don't you come and work at Amrad and take over my role?" So I worked for him for a little while, and then he went back to WeHi full time, and I took over the research position.
There you go.
In Amrad, and I've worked with Doug really ever since. But that was how I got into the biotech sector, and it was, at that point, that was sort of 96. Depending on where you got your funding, it wasn't so hard to get funding. I mean now. You guys would know the success rate for grant
funding. It's quite low these days.
Really,
very competitive.
really tough. But back then it was like in the 30,
Wow.
so like in the 30%. So it was much better, but starting to drop off. And I was just interested in trying something different. So I went to a biotech company, and I just sort of worked my way up through there. And for that. Small companies that are listed on the ASX, there's lots of things that can go wrong, and Amrad, I guess, was a bit before its time. The business model was still difficult to understand for investors and analysts, and so it ran into a little bit of trouble, and eventually ended up splitting in two, with one part pursuing biological medicines, and that's the part that I was involved in. So I went with that part of the company, and we established a new company. We changed the name of that company to Zenith Therapeutics, and I ended up as CEO of that company, which 18 months later got acquired by CSL. So and that was sort of, at the time I can remember thinking, oh no, I really love this small company, and we're getting acquired by these guys. This could be a really bad thing, but a year and a half later, 2008, 2009 was the global financial crisis. Like small biotechs really, really struggled. And we were fortunate enough to be, I guess, somewhat cocooned from that within the CSL environment. And so, 15 years later at CSL, I'm in the position I'm in now and have loved it for the whole time.
What were you like as a kid? Like, I remember when I was in year 3, I would sort of catch insects, and I would put them all in a sort of a multi-purpose Pringles container, and I'd trap them all in there and
fight to the death.
There was like this sort of fascination of little things and figuring out how things work. Was there like a similar sort of experience you had in your childhood?
I look, maybe I had one of those bug catcher toys that the kids all have these days, but. So I'm involved in a few things at CSL now, like the different approaches to taking science into primary schools and secondary schools, and now there's a big effort to expose kids at really young ages to science and to experiments and to biology. But back when in the 1970s, when I was going through, there was none of that really. So whatever your interests were, whatever you made yourself, and so. Yeah, little bits of science and things along the way. But, I grew up in Geelong, which was, 15 minutes from Torquay and Bells Beach. So I grew up surfing and fishing and mainly spending my time looking for other things to do other than schoolwork, basically. But in the end, it's like, you get to like year 10 or 11 and you think, well, I better start thinking about what I'm going to do. So I thought, well, science seems interesting. But my kids have been through VC in the last decade or so, and unlike now where the whole process seems to start 3 years out, and you work your ass off for like 3 years just to get to the end of year 12. back in 1978 or 79, you could do nothing right up until the last 6 months of year 12.
Just cram everything.
Just cram everything into 6 months, get some really good marks, and go to university. Yeah. And the rest of the time you just spend enjoying yourself, really. So, and then it's funny. So I've got an identical twin brother. So when you grow up, you've got this ready-made friend there who is identical to you, so has all the same interests. But so we both moved to Melbourne to go to university, except he ended up doing economics and business, and I ended up doing science and biology. So you always had someone there to compete with and push you along, and the move to university was made easier, care of all that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah, I suppose a lot of scientists at the moment, they're like wanting to go into biotech and such. You mentioned before as well, like it kind of goes back to how competitive it is to get grants and such. Was that ever a worry for you going into science? Did you ever think to yourself, oh, am I getting into a very competitive kind of landscape, job security wise? How did you feel about that?
I could honestly say it wasn't such a thing when I was having these thoughts back in sort of finishing my PhD in sort of 1987, 1988. It wasn't front and center. You weren't worried about where your next dollar was coming from a research funding perspective, and it was a good career to go into. Whereas I think there's a lot of discussion amongst scientists and amongst younger scientists and students these days about just how tough the career is. And look, that's just a pretty brutally honest discussion these days, which I think is a really good thing. But yeah, you didn't worry about those things. You didn't think about that until I guess you were in that working environment, and then you could start understanding the challenges. So you really learn about the challenges as you were experiencing them. You weren't sort of sitting back thinking, well, 5 years from now, if I'm going to be an academic, I'm going to have to worry about that. Whereas I think that happens now. Kids are doing PhDs and thinking, well, the grant system looks pretty tough. Do I really want to be doing that for the rest of my life, or are there other areas where I can use my talents, I guess?
Yeah, interesting. So in this day and age, like if you were a student going through that same process, the same mentality of wondering if you can get a sustainable job with grant funding, what advice would you give to those people?
Look, I think in the end, most people, you've got to follow what you love. And most people that end up doing research and biology really, at that stage in their career, they really love science. Science and medicine and biology, it's fantastic. And once you're involved in research and you're working at that cutting edge and you're publishing papers, it becomes pretty addictive, So I think the first thing you've got to do is just, find the thing you love doing, and then and if it is science and biology, find that niche area of science and biology, because we all, science is split into a million different fields. Find the area that you love the most and that you really want to do, and think about what a career in that space looks like, and give it a shot. I think it's tough, but I don't know. It is pretty daunting, when you're setting out, knowing that unless you're in the top 10%, you're not even you'll struggle to get a grant. So it's pretty daunting. But look, there's a lot of daunting careers around. It's not just science. Not everybody goes on to become a successful, businessman or a successful pilot or whatever it is you choose to do. So science is competitive like everything else, but if you love science, follow what you like, and hopefully you'll be successful.
I just wanted to add another question briefly on this topic. So for a lot, like the PhD graduates of, today's age, what other alternatives are there besides postdoc? Because a lot of my colleagues, for example, feel like they're trapped and that the only kind of position that they can pursue is postdoctoral research.
Yeah, look, and there are a lot of there's still quite a lot of postdoctoral positions around in Australia and globally, and Australian PhD students are really highly rated and will pick up postdoctoral positions in Australia or anywhere outside of Australia. So that's still a relatively good path to pursue. But just thinking beyond that, what are the other options? So within industry, in Australia, it's pretty challenging. CSL is by far the biggest employer, of you know, postdocs, PhDs to come in and do wet lab research. Outside of Australia, there's a lot more opportunity. So in the US, both on the east and the west coast, and in Europe and the UK, the industry sector and the biotech sector is like orders of magnitude bigger than here, and a lot more opportunity to go in and work in a small company or work in a large pharma company. So it's a much easier career trajectory in those environments. But look, I would say too, if you know, doing a really good postdoc, and then coming back and looking for an industry position in Australia is certainly an achievable objective. And doing a good postdoc and ending up, you know, spending some time in industry in Europe or the US or in biotech there is another really great pathway back into that type of career in Australia, if you like. When we look at, you know, we when we're looking to recruit new scientists into our labs, really it's about it's great to get people with lots of experience and have done exactly what you want, but we really just start with their quality as a person and their quality as a scientist. And do they look like they're a really good scientist, and are they a great person that could work as part of a team? And if the answer to that is yes, then all the other stuff's nice to have. Like, yes, they've worked in a company or worked in a biotech, but that's not where we start when we're looking for people.
When you were going through your sort of academic training, was there anyone that you looked up to or that sort of inspired you to continue going down the path that you were on?
Yeah, look, you know, you have plenty of teachers through high school that inspire you, and then you have lecturers when you're doing your undergraduate that you think, wow, that person is really smart. You know, they've got they're a great teacher. You know, I'd really like to work for them. When I was just up in at the Oz Biotech meeting, and I was introducing what's called the Nancy Millis oration. And Nancy Millis was a professor here at Melbourne University in biotechnology. She was only the fourth woman ever to have a full professorship at Melbourne University. And when she was my lecturer, she was my lecturer in biotechnology as an undergraduate. And when I was doing my PhD, she was in the lab next to mine. And she was amazing, and she, you know, certainly inspired me, and her name is still out there and inspires a lot of young people. So, you know, being exposed to really highly motivated, inspirational teachers and you know, scientists, researchers is really important. So, you know, my PhD supervisor, you know, was a fantastic guy. But when you get out into the workforce, whether it's, you know, the other scientists in your institute, or the people within the company that you're working for, you know, there's lots of people along the way that do things differently from the way you do them, and you think, wow, you know, that actually I really like the way that person does that sort of thing. Maybe I should pick up some of those habits. So I had, you know, like I mentioned earlier, the guy I worked for at the vet school, Professor Mel Brandon, he was a real maverick, and had, you know, was way ahead of his time in terms of, you know, translation and commercialization. And he was a fantastic guy to work for, and a lot of, you know, his thinking rubbed off on me. Mm. And then when I've had some really inspirational people that I've worked with subsequently at AMRAD and then at CSL as well. You know, company like CSL, in all parts of the company, there's fantastic people that you can learn a lot of. That's one of the benefits in big companies, is you get to interact with people from all sorts of fields, not just your field, and you can see, you know, how people excel in all sorts of different areas and understand how they do that, and, you know, pick up bits and pieces along the way from them as well.
Yeah, I'd say like it's good to be able to look up to your supervisors in a way.
Yeah,
you know, and kind of drive motivation from that. What makes a good supervisor or a good leader in that sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in the end, for people that do sorts of research and biology that we do, it's a person that's a good scientist, is interested in science and understands the scientific process, and can really teach you about that scientific process. Teach you as a student about how you do research and how you understand what you're doing in the broader context. Because in the end, you can't be working on something that somebody overseas solved 3 years ago. You've got to understand where what you're doing fits in more broadly with the global effort in that research. And a good supervisor will do that. They'll be able to teach you how to do research. They'll have their own place in that sort of global community of people that work in that space, and they'll be able to help you understand where you fit there and guide you to doing research that's new and innovative and novel, and then they'll help you, at the end when it comes to the hard bit, which is writing up your thesis at the end. But I know I've always, before I during my academic career, I had about 6 PhD students, and it's pretty tough as a supervisor having PhD students. I haven't had one since I went into industry, but you've got to be committed, and if students don't have a supervisor that's committed to them, it makes it pretty hard for them.
I'm sort of curious, because you were interested in science from a young age. A lot of students now that are interested in science, they tend to go down the sort of medical pathway and get a doctor of medicine. Now, I'm a medical student, Oliver's a PhD student. What sort of made you decide to go down the research pathway over a medicine pathway? No offense taken.
Yeah, no. And I did spend some early time in my career regretting the fact that I'd gone down pure science, not down the medicine pathway, because somehow that seemed like it might be more stable and might be more productive. But ultimately, the world needs more scientists. The world needs good scientists, and if the biological scientists happen to have a medical degree as well, that's fantastic. So, I mean, we need both. These groups of professional people. Certainly, we need both of them. I personally, I just found all of the idea of having to treat patients all the time and interact with sick people. It's not something that really appeals to me. But the idea of being on the bench doing experiments and somehow finding yourself at the cutting edge of human knowledge in your particular field was ultimately a really exciting thing. And once you get into that space, you realize that this is what you want to do. But I think the physician scientists are a hugely valuable asset to companies and biotech companies that are working in drug development for a couple of reasons. One, of course, valuable just because they're good scientists and they can contribute all of the ideas that or contribute to all of the ideas that you've got going on. But also, they, depending on the career path they've taken, they can have that perspective that you don't get having worked on the bench the whole time. So they can bring a patient perspective to the research, which can be really important. But within a company environment, ultimately, the further along you get in your career, probably the less it matters which of those particular pathways you came from, because they end up all converging and being equally valuable. But certainly, we need to find a way for more people that have chosen the clinical path to then realise that actually I really love research. I want to do a PhD, and I'm going to head down that path now. So there needs to be a clear path to be able to do that.
Yeah, on the note of kind of, a lot of people feeling like they want to go into medicine rather than research, I feel like a lot of that comes from parents, like parents wanting their children to, pursue medical career because of, sustainability, financial remuneration, other things alike. Do you think that that's a good thing?
Well, it's just a thing. I mean, I think, I don't know that it's good or bad, but we've all got parents that have that same sort of thinking. I mean, in the end, from a parent's perspective, but even from the kid, basically, it's like, I can be a doctor. I know what a doctor does because I go and see the doctor all the time. Or I can be a scientist. I don't really know what scientists do. I see them on TV every now and then, but what is it you do when you're a scientist? How do you be a scientist, and how do you be successful as a scientist? It's still a pretty opaque career for people coming up through school and even through university. And I think there's a lot of effort that's gone into making that clearer for kids moving forward through the GTAC Centre over at the University High, through a whole lot of other programs that are in place now, where a career as a scientist is not sort of this black box thing that it used to be. And so, when they ask that question, yes, I can see what a doctor does. I go and see one every 6 months, but I can also see what a scientist does because, I understand now that's been part of my education, and I can appreciate that this is what my job will look like, And if you're having, you can imagine if you're having trouble as an 18-year-old or a 20-year-old sort of understanding that difference. If your parents aren't scientists themselves and they're in their 40s or 50s or whatever, it's probably even more opaque to them about what scientists do. So,
yeah. I think on that note, suppose that we had a medical student that was interested in transitioning to science, and their parents were non-scientist 40 to 50-year-olds that were really concerned about the students. So, whoever the student is.
He's definitely projecting.
What would you say to the mother of this child, to reassure them that sort of science, entrepreneurship and commercialization is a viable path?
Look, in the end, as a parent, I think trying to push your children down a career pathway that you think is a good one, not what they think is a good one, it's not really going to get you anywhere anyway. And I think these days, my observation would be most kids don't really, buy into that. Certainly whenever I tell my kids what they should be doing, they'll go and do exactly what they want to do anyway. So I think that's becoming less and less a thing, that parents are really, have this really, I guess, closed view as to what's a successful outcome for their child versus what's a riskier one, and are more likely, to encourage their kids to pursue the areas that really interest them and find a career in that space, because, there's a whole diverse world of careers out there, and, it's easy for parents to say, well, I want my kid to be a doctor or a lawyer, but, that's probably about 1% of all the things you could possibly do.
Yeah.
I don't know how you give them any more comfort, though.
Yeah. Look, Andrew, you kind of sparked an interest in immunology, when you started your PhD and such. Where do you think the field is at right now? What do you think the future of the field is? Immunology.
It's I would say one of the transitions has, over the last few years, has really seen a translation of basic immunology into clinical outcomes. So, when I was doing my PhD, there was a lot of unknowns. As an example, when I was doing undergraduate work, nobody had cloned or understood the structure of T cell receptors, for example. Whereas now, that's probably taught in year 12 or something. But I think that the really big revolution has been, for example, in the immuno-oncology space, and that's really has involved taking everything that's been learnt about immunology and the immune response over the last 20 years and turning that into a practical outcome for a cancer patient. And so, there's still a lot to learn about the basic immune response itself and the fundamentals. But I think the really exciting thing is that the fundamentals have transitioned to such a point that it's now turning into therapies that are treating people that would otherwise have no options. And I think that's really exciting. And I think, it's cancer now. It'll be autoimmune disease and other immune inflammatory related diseases moving forward, where all of that, there's decades and decades of basic immunology research are really starting to translate into meaningful benefits for patients.
What are you most excited about? in terms of the future of immunotherapies more generally?
Um, it's a good question. I mean, I think there is an opportunity in, for example, the oncology space to really take what has been achieved so far and really build on that to have something that is much more effective and can be used in a whole broader range of circumstances. So we're still really in the very formative stages of, CAR T cells, antibodies that are targeting negative regulators of the immune response, PD-1 inhibitors, those sorts of things. They haven't been around for that long, yet somehow they've become really an accepted part of the treatment process. And so I think, when I look at the small companies, just yesterday I was meeting a small company up in Brisbane who's right at the forefront of putting CAR receptors into myeloid cells and using other cell populations other than T cells to treat solid tumours. And they've got a really novel approach to do that, and it's just really exciting to listen to them. So I think that that we need to remember that whole space is really at the very beginning, and we're sorting out the efficacy, so we'll get more efficacious therapies, and we're still sorting out the safety as well. So some of those treatments come with some pretty serious adverse events. But when you're an oncology patient, you can tolerate those because the options aren't there. So I think we'll end up getting safer outcomes as well. So I think, we'll end up with immunotherapy that's much more effective in oncology, but we'll also end up using immunotherapies in a broader range of diseases beyond cancer.
Well, I'm not sure if this is an area of interest of yours, but what are your thoughts on sort of RNA-driven therapeutics as opposed to sort of cell-based ones?
Yeah, well, so it's a big interest of ours. I mean, CSL has a big vaccine business. It's called CSL Seqirus, probably the number 1 or 2 manufacturer of influenza vaccines globally. And those vaccines made using what you would call traditional vaccine technology. And so we have a really strong interest in RNA vaccines and RNA technology and how that might work in terms of influenza vaccines. So I think the RNA technology and the vaccine certainly came to the fore during COVID. Those vaccines still have a number of limitations, which I think have to be overcome in terms of them becoming much more widespread. And I think it's really yet to be determined whether ultimately you get a better immune response from an RNA vaccine versus a vaccine that's made using traditional technology. So I think it's certainly a really hyped area. So depending on who you listen to, whether they're academics, whether they're from a company, or whether they're in government, the world is going to be cured by RNA technology within the next 5 years. So
Yeah.
it is way overhyped, but it has delivered some great outcomes during the COVID pandemic. And I think there's a lot of opportunities that people are pursuing. And CSL isn't there. We have what's called a second generation RNA technology, self-amplifying RNA. We're pursuing that in COVID, in influenza, in other respiratory diseases and non-respiratory diseases. And the use of RNA in oncology vaccines, I think, is something that's being pursued as well. The other area I think that gets talked about is in protein replacement therapy. So CSL has a long history in protein replacement therapy. I think there's I don't think RNA for the most part will work well in protein replacement, precisely because of the reason it works well in vaccines, where you get relatively short-term, high-level expression, induces an immune response, and then it stops. With patients with protein deficiencies, I think there's probably going to be better ways to treat those patients.
Yeah. That's very fascinating, actually. Yeah. So I guess I want to transition a little bit into kind of talking about strengths and areas of growth. So in your position that you're in at CSL, if you were to consider yourself to have a superpower, what do you think that might be?
Look, I think a couple of things. I think I generally get on with people really well, and I think I have a pretty good ability to figure out how people fit within what we're trying to achieve at CSL. So that group has grown from 30 people to almost 400 people over the last 10 or so years, and we've managed to bring in some really fantastic people, and we have a great team environment. So I'd like to think that somehow I've contributed some of the thinking that's helped develop a really strong team there. I think I'm okay at being able to take the science and that reductionist view and think about it more broadly and how it might fit into a medical context. And then think more broadly about how our research fits into the bigger CSL environment. That can be sometimes challenging. So being able to take the small picture and really understand where it fits into that big picture context, is something that you need to be able to do. And I think I've managed to be able to do that. But they're not really superpowers. They're just the sorts of things you need when you're trying to be successful in a career. I don't think I've ever been a really good scientist. I've been an okay scientist, but I think I've had a good ability to pick good scientists and who I want to work with. So I've worked with some great scientists, and I just marvel at the way they can understand things and interpret things and integrate a whole lot of knowledge and being able to I guess partner with those people and bring those people into your organization, I think is a skill too. And I think that's something that's really helped me as well.
I suppose on the flip side, in your professional life more so, what's something that you struggle with?
I guess sometimes with patients, developing a drug is really a huge team effort. It just involves multiple groups with different talents, and sometimes when you're right at the start of that process, there's so many other groups that you need to rely on to bring their skills to bear on the project to make it successful. That is out of your control, and it can be a little easy to get frustrated and question whether other people are doing their job as well as they should be. So I think I've probably been guilty of that over the years. I try not to be, and I think I'm probably not as guilty of it now as I used to be. So just understanding that everybody is finds what they're doing challenging, but nevertheless everybody is still motivated and trying to do the right thing, and they'll do much better if you help them rather than get in their way is probably something that I might have struggled with a little bit earlier, but not so much these days, I don't think. Although other people, of course, might have a different view on that if you ask them. What else? I would say I think everybody as you're progressing through your career struggles with self-doubt. So learning how to deal with self-doubt, having the confidence to put an opinion out there, to take risks. I think in drug development, there's a lot of risk-taking involved, and people are always looking for your view on a particular issue. So, you've got to learn to have the confidence to put your view forward and be comfortable taking the risk that you might be wrong. And that's what leads to the self-doubt. And so, everyone struggles with that. And I've certainly struggled with it over the years. What the hell am I doing trying to run research at CSL? There must be lots of other people that could do this better than me. And then you sort of shake yourself, get up and keep going. So I think that's something that you sort of have to, but I think everybody probably has to struggle with that. It's a pretty unique person can go through their whole life, absolutely confident that they're the best person for the job every step of the way.
Do you think that you were risk averse when you started out?
Look, probably. And I'm at the sort of, I've come to be much more comfortable because I'm at the really risky end of the drug development business. So when we start a research project, statistically there's less than a 5% chance that it'll ultimately end up as even getting into patients, let alone being a successful medicine. So you sort of learn to become really comfortable with failure because that takes a while. So, at the start of your career, every failure seems like a huge setback that you're never going to get over. But at the end, failures are ultimately a mark of success, because if you're not in there trying, if you're not in there giving it a go, then you're never going to get that one opportunity to do something really important. So yeah, I think you become more comfortable with risk, but that's because you become more comfortable with the thought of failure, and you realise that's part of the whole process, I would say.
It all sounds really stressful, Andrew. I think, Oliver and I have our own ways of sort of managing with stress as sort of startup founders and going through the academic process. Oliver likes to go on 6-kilometer runs with his military friend Mus, and I like to go to a Japanese bathhouse once a week and just relax, unwind. What do? Do you still surf?
No, I don't. But it's interesting. Some of my friends who I used to surf with, still at my age, are still getting out there and doing all the things that put them at risk. I do other things. I go fishing. I play golf. I'm into watchmaking and watches.
Nice.
I
actually built this watch.
Yeah.
All right.
With a kit though. Like I didn't manufacture the mechanism, but
I'm more
I
I
did put it together.
I get old watches and get them working again. So
That's
I do
interesting.
that sort of thing.
It's a good hobby.
It's
fascinating.
Good hobby. I love it. Yeah. So yeah, golf, fishing, watches, travel, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
You need to find a way to unwind, or else you just go mad. And I think that's one of the things you need to have that ability to compartmentalize, because whether it's like, I can remember when CSL was buying the biotech company I was involved in, and you'd spend all day wondering what shareholders were thinking. Is the price right? What's everybody's future once CSL takes over? And it's just, the stress is unbelievable, and you've got other people's careers hanging on your decision. You guys are starting your own company. You've got to have a way of turning off from that. You've got to be able to put that in the box and close that box for a while and go and do something you enjoy, or else you'll just burn yourself out, I guess.
I feel like stress sometimes comes from time management. At least I find that. Yeah. How do you manage your time with all the different things that you're navigating?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So these days it's called work-life balance. And we do employee surveys twice a year, and one of our questions is asking people, how's your work-life balance?
What are some of the responses?
Well, so if we can get like 60 to 70 percent of our staff saying they're happy with their work-life balance,
then that's considered good.
That's considered good. I always find that work-life balance is, it's something you have to manage yourself. If you're relying on someone else to manage your work-life balance, it's doomed to failure, and it can be hard. But particularly in a scientific career, and a startup career, where it's all about self-motivation. No one else is standing around beating you with a stick, telling you've got to work. It's all coming from yourself. So you've got to learn to manage your own time in a way that leaves you healthy and able to get up and start the next day. And I'm like a lot of other people. In my late 20s, when I finished my PhD, I was in academia. I was writing multiple grants at the same time, and I sort of lost the plot for a while and had a few issues. But then over the years, you learn how to deal with that. And in the end, you need to be able to switch off and go and do the things you love doing, and then come back to work ready to go again. But if with that, we do all of these surveys. It's like, well, are you happy with your work-life balance? And then the answers come back not as good as we would like. So then, what are we going to do about it at CSL? As if somehow there's a magic answer to getting everybody happy with their work-life balance. So you can certainly do things as a company to help people relax and get that work-life balance. But I think the main thing is encourage encouraging people to learn how to do that themselves and learn how to switch off and relax.
How does CSL facilitate that?
Well, one way we have a really flexible workplace, and you can have it. I think science leads itself to quite a flexible workplace because, your experiments will have natural breaks, and might not be doing something one day, and you can take some time off. But so beyond that thing that's inherent with the career, I think one of the big things that we've done is we have these meeting-free weeks. So it used to be two a year. Now I think it's 4 a year, where for a week no one's allowed to schedule any meetings, and people can just do what they want for a week, and they don't have to be on Teams. Yeah. I mean, Teams is something that certainly contributed to the decline in everybody's. And so it got us through COVID, but I think post-COVID, if someone blew up Teams, then that wouldn't be such a bad thing. But so we have like 4 weeks a year where there's like no Teams meetings. You can sit back and you can do all those. You can catch up on the work you want to catch up on. You've got time for your own thinking. We always encourage our scientists to be innovating themselves, to be coming up with their own ideas, and their response will be, well, you never give us time to do that because we're always working on these other projects. So we're always trying to find space for them to have that time and to feel that they can innovate. And so things like the meeting-free weeks and other initiatives like that, which free up people's time, actually has a benefit for the company anyway, because it refreshes people. When being innovative is challenging, so it gives them time to relax and become innovative and contribute.
Yeah. One of the things that Oliver and I are really interested in is just this sense of successful people having certain morning routines. There's a common mantra that, like, in order to be successful, you have to wake up at 4:30 a.m.
No, 3:30 a.m.
3:30 a.m. Cook your eggs,
cold plunge,
then cycle to work, and then just get started straight away. Do you feel like you have a unconventional morning routine, or is it like pretty sort of stock standard?
I would say my morning routine goes through phases. So my morning routine phase at the moment is my daughter's a PhD, so she's a postdoc, and she works at the University of Melbourne. So we get up and go to work, and we go to the same coffee shop every morning and have the same coffee and hot chocolate and cake. And then after I've had the hot chocolate and the coffee with her, I feel ready for the work. And if I don't do that, then I'm thinking, I really missed that coffee with my daughter this morning. So,
my morning's
that's the phase I'm in at the moment. But other times it's not such a routine, I guess. And with global companies and the curse of the meeting culture, sometimes it's hard to get into a routine because there's meeting depending on whether it's daylight savings here or in the US, for example. You'll have meetings early in the morning, you'll have meetings late at night, and so it makes it a bit harder.
Yeah, there should be like a permanent ban on meetings before 12 p.m.
I think. And not after 5 p.m. and certainly not after 5 p.m. on a Friday. That's even more important.
Absolutely.
I suppose I just try to cram all my meetings into one day.
Really?
Because otherwise it just disrupts my workflow massively.
As long as they're not spread out across the entire day, and then you've got like 30 minutes to do work, and you've got another meet. That's just
yeah.
Too much task shifting. You just can't get into a deep state of work.
Well, I mean, I think the meeting culture is something that companies, and I guess any work environment really needs to get right, because otherwise just people find themselves in meetings the whole time. And when you think about it afterwards, did I really contribute to that meeting? Did that meeting decide anything useful at all? And the answer is a lot of the time probably not. Yeah. So, that's one of the things that we try and focus on is like trying to, scale back people's commitment to these sorts of things.
I feel like a lot of meetings can be 5 minutes, but they end up taking half an hour.
Yeah.
You almost can just jump in there and say, okay, action items, everyone, bang, bang, bang. All right, I'll see you all tomorrow. Take care.
Yeah, and
get to work.
We've all come across the person that loves the meetings and they just talk forever, and all the other people who just sit there waiting for it to end so they can get out. So it's got to be a happy medium.
Absolutely.
I feel like that's me.
Yeah, I'd say so. I urge on the idea of having shorter meetings. Ben tends to elaborate a little bit more. Try to motivate the team. I think together we make a good balance. It ends up being about an hour. So, yeah. Look, Ben and I are are fairly avid readers or listening to audiobooks and such. I'm reading the Elon Musk biography at the moment on the back end of a conversation with Ben and a couple of friends. What books do you read?
So I guess I'm listening to a lot of podcasts at the moment, which we talked about earlier, and they tend to be history podcasts. And the ones I'm really into at the moment are the Revolutions podcast by Mike Duncan. I started at the finish, so I did his last one first, which was the Russian Revolution, and having finished that one, I've gone back to his first one, which is the history of Rome, and so I've got a few in between. And actually, at the moment, I'm reading something that's a little bit connected to it, because I'm reading a book called Stalin's Wine Cellar.
Okay.
Which is a fascinating story about these two Australian guys that got on to the fact that somewhere in Georgia, in Tbilisi, there was a cellar in an old vineyard where a whole lot of wine that had been taken from Tsar Nicholas II by the communists and subsequently, taken by Stalin for his own personal collection, and then stashed away before World War II started. Actually, as the Germans were approaching Russia during World War II, well, I better go and hide all my important wine. So he took all this wine and stashed it in this cellar down in Georgia, and it had been hidden there for like 60 years. And these two Australian guys found out about it. And so in the book, where I'm up to in the book, they've just got to the cellar and they've just got their flashlights on, going through all of these wines that are like Chateau Yquems and all of these other famous French vintages from like the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s that were all collected by the last Tsar of Russia. So it sort of connects in with the Russian podcast and the revolution, but also with, I guess, my interest in wines as well.
Yeah, pour me a glass.
So yeah, that's a great read.
So, like, based on these podcasts that you've been listening to, what's something that you've learnt?
Well, so I've learnt a lot about history. So I think everybody has a notion of, the Soviet Union and what it means to be a communist state. But listening to that podcast, it starts with Marx and Engels and the development of Marxist theory, socialist theory, and then it takes you all the way through how that theory was taken up by the revolutionaries in different places, and ultimately by the Russian revolutionaries, and then their failed revolutions, and then ultimately their success, and it talks about all of the main characters that we all know through that process, like Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky, and so that connection between the origins of communism and socialist theory, how the Russians picked it up, how they tried to integrate it into their party, and then ultimately how it all fell apart, because instead of becoming about socialist theory and the people who was meant to benefit, it just became about the Communist Party and the way to maintain the party in power.
And greed and power.
Yeah, greed. That's what it came down to: greed and power. So I love podcasts where at the end of it, a ton more than you knew at the start of it.
Absolutely.
There's a common saying that history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. One of the reasons that I think Oliver and I and yourself are sort of drawn to history is so that we have an awareness of what's happened in the past, almost in a way of feeling like we can predict the future, or feeling like we can place today in some map of history. There's also this other notion at the moment where it seems like a lot is going wrong in the world right now. We've almost we sort of thought we were at the end of history. The US was the world superpower, and then now we have wars going on again, and it does sort of feel like we might be, I don't know, at the beginning of something new. Yeah,
something interesting or different. Who knows?
Do you think we're sort of at a bad place in history? What's sort of your point? Do you have hope for the future?
Well, I like the idea that the whole story just cycles over and over with different variations, and if you go through history and look at the rise and fall of empires and the rise and fall of political parties and powerful individuals, it's all the same. It's all for the same reasons. It's all about power and wealth and personal ambition. and sometimes it's buried within political parties, and other times it's not. But it is amazing the way it repeats and repeats. So I think there's no doubt over the last 20 or 30 years the world has gone through a huge change in terms of the availability of information and all of our ability to understand at a really micro level what's going on in all other parts of the world, whereas that never used to be the case. So all of a sudden everything seems much worse than it was. Daily on your news feed you can read about 25 different wars in different countries around the world, which seems really bad, but it's probably no worse than it was 50 or 100 or even 1,000 years ago, where you just didn't have that information flow. So I think things can seem worse than they are. I'm always wary of people who make the comment, well, it never used to be like this back in my day, or it never used to be like this, where it probably used to be exactly the same. You either just didn't know or was in a different guise. But look, I don't know. There are lots of things going on in the moment that cause us, lots of concern, whether it's in the Middle East or in Europe, the state of politics in the US, the state of politics in Australia. There's lots of cause for concern. But by the same token, I mean, the advances in science and technology and, the opportunities that are there for us are huge. So I think, humans are naturally optimistic as a race. So I think there's lots of reason for optimism. And you've just got to hope the reasons for optimism outweigh those for pessimism in the majority of people. And we'll keep moving forward.
Definitely. I want to change things up a little bit, make it a little bit more lighthearted. Right?
Quick fire.
This is the good part, all right? So this is the quick fire round. Basically, we're going to just ask you a series of questions that were generated by AI.
Oh.
And the idea is that you just rapidly respond, first kind of inclination to the answer.
First thought that comes to your mind.
First thought that comes to mind. Don't worry, if it's too out there, outlandish, we can edit it. Do you want to kick it off?
If you had to rename the periodic table, what would you call it?
The table of stuff.
The table of stuff. Great. Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
Which scientist, past or present, would you invite for dinner?
McFarlane Burnett.
Why? To do.
He's the father of immunology and one of the greatest Australian scientists. And if you have a look at all of the things that he did back in his day, and you see that even today they're still relevant and still important in terms of medicine and development.
Great. What's the weirdest experiment you've ever been part of?
We were transplanting sheep lymphocytes into small mini pigs to look at
xenograft.
to look at how the immune response to xenograft.
Yeah.
And we had the ability in those larger animals to cannulate lymph nodes, so you could challenge very locally with the xenografted tissue, and you could look at exactly what was happening in the lymph node. And in hindsight, it seems a bit weird, but that was.
Wonder if it would get past ethics these days.
Well, I
suppose
ethics is certainly at a much higher level than it was when I was doing my PhD. That's for sure.
Do you have any guilty pleasures after a tough day in the lab?
Yeah. A double Negroni would probably be my main guilty pleasure.
Do you know any funny scientific jokes?
No. I probably do, but I can't remember them at
no worries.
the spur of the moment.
What's your favorite element and why? I think this question's for like a chemistry professor.
Yeah. Let's just say iron, because it's so important to life and blood and the structure of hemoglobin, and without iron, you'd be in a lot of trouble, but nevertheless it can still cause lots of pathology and disease as well. So iron, I'll go with iron.
There you go. If you weren't a scientist, what would you have become?
A professional golfer. But I think I would have been relatively limited by talent. Yeah, so I wouldn't have progressed too far.
What's what lab equipment represents your personality the best?
Lab equipment. maybe a balance, trying to get the weight of everything right and trying to, make sure you've not got too much or too little of what it is to get the right outcome.
There you go. Maybe one more?
I'm not sure.
I'll ask one anyway. Is cereal soup? Deep philosophical question.
Yes.
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 He's gone with yes.
Awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on. We'll wrap up now.
Or at least that section. We might.
Oh, you want some more questions?
Yeah, no, I thought we'd move on to the final part of like the segment, which is kind of peeling back time, traditional orange style.
The orange.
Orange. So we had a previous guest, Professor Edward Hovey.
True.
Who left quite a fascinating question for you to reflect on and give an answer to. So the question actually is...
This one here.
Is it this one?
Yep.
Yeah. Is it justifiable to step away from a high-paying career that doesn't bring personal fulfillment, even at the cost of losing societal prestige and financial security that supports your family?
I'd say not only is it justifiable, it's almost inevitable these days, and so yes, people should be doing it. The only caveat would be you just got to think about when you pull the plug or pull the pin. Basically, you don't want to come home one day, decide you can't stand this career anymore, and go in the next day and resign. If you've got commitments and other issues, you might face a challenge there. But you think about it, then who wants to spend the rest of their life doing something they hate? That's one of the good things about being a scientist, right? You can spend the rest of your life doing the things you love.
That's true.
Hopefully, you can, assuming you stay engaged and enjoy it, continue to enjoy it.
And what's a question that you'd like to leave for our next guest?
Whoever that might be.
I think rational decision making and data-based decisions are really important at every level of society. Yet somehow at some of the most important levels, that's not what's happening anymore. So what can we as a society do and as individuals to do to try and bring back really data logic driven decision making for those things that really impact us? Is there anything obvious that we can do, because we seem to be heading in the wrong direction?
That's a very philosophical question, I think.
Agreed.
Perhaps we'll just ask one last question before we wrap it up. When the final chapter of your life's book is written, what do you hope the closing line will convey?
That I made an important contribution to the success of science and our technology sector here in Australia. That the biotech sector and the translation of science from our institutes is better for the contribution I made while I was working.
Brilliant.
Fascinating. Well, this has been the Orange Podcast. We'd like to thank Melbourne Connect Co-working for sponsoring this episode, and thank you, Andrew, for coming on.
Yeah, it's been a great pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew.
Now, we talk a lot about business and entrepreneurship, but to build the future, you need people and a place to build from.
Discover the perfect workspace for collaboration and productivity.
Melbourne Connect Co-working is offering our viewers an exclusive 25% discount on 12-month memberships.
Quote Orange when you submit your inquiry. Links are available in the description now.